Won the night she stopped explaining. She didn't leave that night. She just stopped explaining. There's a difference. It was subtle. No slammed doors, no dramatic speeches, no tears running down her face. Just a pause that lasted longer than usual. And then another. And then silence where reassurance used to live. Ethan noticed it, but not in the way you think. He noticed the quiet, the way someone notices the AC turning off in the middle of summer. Not panic, just discomfort, something missing. Claire used to explain everything. Why she felt distant. Why his tone hurt. Why she needed more than logic. Why silence scared her. And that night, she didn't. She asked one simple question. Are you even here with me? He responded the way he always did. Calm, controlled, rational. I'm right here. But he wasn't. Not emotionally. Not in the way she meant. And something shifted in her eyes. Not anger, not sadness, something colder, something resolved. Here's the part most people miss. The relationship didn't break when she left. It started breaking the moment she stopped explaining herself. When a woman stops asking you to understand her, she has already begun grieving you. Ethan didn't know that. He mistook her calm for maturity. He mistook her silence for peace. He mistook her withdrawal for stability. And if this already feels uncomfortably familiar, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Because some stories don't shout. They whisper, and they stay. That night, Claire went to bed without finishing the conversation. Ethan stayed up scrolling, relieved the conflict had ended. But conflict hadn't ended. Connection had. And that was the first crack. He just didn't know it yet. To his definition of strength. Ethan always believed he was the stable one. He didn't yell. He didn't slam doors. He didn't spiral. In his mind, that was strength. He grew up watching men lose control. He promised himself he would never be that man. Never reactive, never needy, never emotional in a way that could be used against him. So he built something quieter. He built control. When Claire cried, he stayed steady. When she asked for reassurance, he offered logic. When she said, I feel disconnected, he replied, we're fine. He thought calmness was maturity. He thought restraint was love. What he never questioned was this. Was he present, or just composed? There's a difference between being peaceful and being unavailable. Ethan confused the two. He believed love meant not needing too much. Not asking for too much. Not feeling too much. And when Claire tried to reach for something deeper, more eye contact, more vulnerability, more shared fear, he would gently step back. Not aggressively, not cruelly. Just enough to stay safe. He called it independence. But independence can become isolation when no one is allowed inside. Claire once told him, softly, I don't need you to fix it. I just need you to feel it with me. He nodded. But inside, he resisted. Feeling it meant losing control. Feeling it meant entering uncertain territory. Feeling it meant risking being seen. And Ethan did not know how to be seen without armor. So he stayed rational. He stayed balanced. He stayed emotionally minimal. He didn't realize that emotional minimalism feels like emotional absence to the person who loves you. Strength, to him, meant not reacting. To her, strength meant staying. He thought he was protecting the relationship from chaos. But slowly, he was starving it of oxygen. And the cruel irony? He truly believed he was doing everything right. Free the pattern he never saw. Patterns rarely look dramatic while they're forming. They look ordinary. Claire was always the one who started the hard conversations. Can we talk? I've been feeling something. I don't want this to drift. Ethan would sigh, not out of anger, but out of fatigue. He didn't understand why things couldn't just be calm. But calm, to Claire, felt like distance. And distance, to Ethan, felt safe. Every time she reached for him emotionally, she extended a bridge. Every time he responded with analysis instead of presence, he removed a plank. Slowly, quietly. No explosions, no betrayal. Just erosion. When she cried, he told her she was overthinking. When she worried, he reassured her with statistics. When she needed closeness, he gave her solutions. He wasn't dismissing her. He genuinely believed he was helping. But help without empathy feels like dismissal. There were small moments. She would say, "I miss you," while sitting right next to him. He would answer, "I'm here." And technically, he was. Physically present. Emotionally guarded. Claire began adjusting. She shortened her sentences. She softened her tone. She asked for less. Because asking and not receiving hurts more than silence. This is how emotional abandonment begins. Not with cruelty. Not with shouting. But with subtle misalignment repeated over time. Ethan thought repetition meant stability. Claire felt repetition meant loneliness. And the pattern solidified. She pursued. He retreated. She explained. He rationalized. She felt. He analyzed. Until one day, she stopped pursuing. And that silence felt different. Not dramatic. Final. 4. Emotional minimalism. Emotional minimalism looks clean from the outside. No chaos. No scenes. No exhausting arguments. Just smooth edges. Ethan liked smooth edges. When Claire tried to unpack her feelings, he would simplify them. "You're just stressed. It's not that deep. You're overthinking." He didn't say it harshly. He said it gently. Which somehow made it worse. Because dismissal wrapped in calm sounds like wisdom. But wisdom without attunement feels lonely. Claire wasn't asking for solutions. She was asking for resonance. There's a difference between fixing and feeling. Ethan defaulted to fixing. If she felt insecure, he reminded her of facts. If she felt hurt, he explained intent. If she felt disconnected, he promised future plans. Everything was logical. Nothing was intimate. He believed intimacy was implied. She needed it expressed. And slowly, she began editing herself. She stopped describing her inner world in detail. She shortened vulnerable sentences into manageable phrases. She translated emotion into something easier for him to digest. Because when you consistently feel misunderstood, you begin to reduce yourself. Not dramatically. Incrementally. Ethan admired how low maintenance she had become. He didn't realize she had simply stopped asking to be seen. Emotional minimalism feels peaceful to the one who avoids depth. It feels suffocating to the one who craves it. Claire once reached for his hand during a difficult moment. He squeezed back briefly, then checked his phone. It wasn't cruelty. It was priority. And that's when something in her recalibrated. She understood the hierarchy now. She would always come after comfort. After routine. After control. And so she began withdrawing in ways he couldn't measure. Because what cannot be measured is often ignored. 5. The first internal exit. The first exit is rarely physical. It's internal. Invisible. Claire didn't pack a bag. She packed away expectation. That's the shift no one sees. She stopped imagining the version of him who would eventually understand. She stopped rehearsing conversations in her head. She stopped hoping that the next discussion would go differently. Hope quietly retired. And when hope retires, effort follows. Ethan noticed she wasn't initiating as much. He interpreted it as peace. No more heavy talks. No more emotional storms. He felt relief. But relief can be dangerous when it replaces connection. Claire began building a private emotional world. Not with someone else. With herself. She journaled instead of confiding. She processed alone instead of reaching. She cried quietly instead of asking for comfort. Because asking had started to feel embarrassing. When your needs are consistently minimized, you begin minimizing them yourself. Ethan mistook her independence for growth. He didn't see it as adaptation. Adaptation to absence. There was one night she looked at him differently. Not searching. Not pleading. Just observing. As if she were slowly memorizing the way he never quite arrived emotionally. And something in him felt unsettled. But he pushed it away. Discomfort doesn't last long when you're trained to override it. Claire's internal exit was calm. That's what makes it so irreversible. No rage. No betrayal. No explosion. Just a decision forming quietly. I can't feel alone next to someone anymore. And once that sentence takes root, the countdown begins. 6. The illusion of stability. From the outside, they looked fine. No arguments. No dramatic tension. No visible cracks. Ethan actually felt proud of that. He believed they had matured past emotional turbulence. He told himself, this is what healthy looks like. Calm dinners, predictable weekends, fewer hard conversations. But stability without intimacy is just stillness. And stillness can hide decay. Claire no longer challenged him. No longer asked the difficult questions. No longer said, we need to talk. Ethan interpreted that as trust. It wasn't trust. It was surrender. There's a quiet stage in relationships where one person stops fighting for connection. Not because they don't care, but because caring has become exhausting. Claire was tired. Tired of translating her feelings. Tired of shrinking her needs. Tired of reaching across an emotional distance that never quite closed. So she stopped reaching. And when someone stops reaching, the distance doesn't shrink. It expands. Ethan enjoyed the quiet. He mistook it for harmony. He thought, finally, we're solid. But solid isn't the same as connected. He didn't notice that her laughter was lighter, less anchored. He didn't notice that her eye contact was shorter. He didn't notice the way she paused before answering simple questions, as if calculating how much of herself to reveal. He only noticed the absence of conflict. And in his mind, that meant success. The illusion of stability is seductive. It tells you nothing is wrong. It rewards you with comfort. But comfort can be the enemy of awareness. Because while he relaxed into routine, she was quietly detaching from it. And the most dangerous thing about quiet detachment? It doesn't announce itself. It prepares itself. 7. Her emotional withdrawal. Withdrawal doesn't always look cold. Sometimes it looks calm. Claire wasn't angry anymore. That's what confused Ethan. She smiled. She showed up. She answered when he spoke. But something essential was missing. She stopped leaning into him on the couch. Stopped lingering during hugs. Stopped sharing the tiny, unnecessary details of her day. Those details are intimacy. And when they disappear, something deeper is fading. Ethan noticed, but he framed it differently. She's just busy. She's stressed. It'll pass. He underestimated quiet shifts. There was one moment that should have alarmed him. She laughed at a joke he made. But her eyes didn't follow. Her eyes were somewhere else. Not on someone else. Just elsewhere. That's emotional withdrawal. Not seeking replacement. Seeking relief. Claire wasn't planning an exit strategy. She was protecting herself from further depletion. Every time she had reached and felt emptiness in return, something inside her recalibrated. Eventually, self-protection becomes instinct. She began responding instead of initiating. Listening instead of revealing. Existing instead of engaging. Ethan felt a faint unease. But he labeled it insecurity and suppressed it. Because acknowledging the shift would require confronting his role in it. And confrontation meant discomfort. So he chose comfort again. What he didn't realize. When someone emotionally withdraws, they're not waiting to see if you notice. They're waiting to see if you feel it. And he didn't. 8. The final conversation. The final conversation rarely sounds final. It sounds calm. Claire chose a Tuesday evening. No dramatic timing. Just quiet clarity. We need to talk. Ethan felt a flicker of irritation. Not fear. Not urgency. Just inconvenience. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She didn't cry. That unsettled him more than anger would have. I don't feel close to you anymore. He responded quickly. We've been good. We haven't even been fighting. She nodded. That's the problem. He didn't understand. To him, The absence of conflict meant success. To her, the absence of emotional depth meant loneliness. "I kept trying to reach you," she said softly. "And after a while, I stopped." There was no bitterness in her tone. Only fatigue. That's when something inside him finally stirred. Not because she was leaving, but because she wasn't fighting to stay. Fighting means hope. Calm means decision. He tried to reason. "We can fix this." She didn't argue. She didn't debate. She just said, "I don't want to feel alone next to you anymore." And in that sentence, everything collapsed. He suddenly replayed every small moment he had minimized. Every sigh. Every shortened sentence. Every quiet pause. He had thought strength meant not reacting. Now he realized it had meant not responding. And by the time he felt it, she was already gone emotionally. The door didn't slam. It closed softly. And that softness was unbearable. 9 after she leaves. The apartment didn't change. But everything felt louder. The hum of the refrigerator. The ticking clock. The echo of his own footsteps. Silence, when shared, feels peaceful. Silence alone feels accusatory. Ethan walked past the couch where she used to lean into him. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom. He noticed the side of the closet that was now half empty. There were no dramatic tears. Just a quiet recalibration of reality. He told himself, "It's temporary." He told himself, "She just needs space." But space had never been the problem. Distance had. He replayed their last conversation, searching for something explosive he could blame. A sharp word, a harsh tone, a definitive mistake. There was none. That unsettled him more. If there had been a fight, he could categorize it. If there had been betrayal, he could justify it. But there had only been erosion. And erosion doesn't give you a single moment to fix. He began noticing details he had once ignored. The way she used to wait half a second longer before responding. The way she would glance at him, hoping for more. The way her shoulders subtly dropped when he changed the subject. These weren't dramatic signals. They were invitations. Invitations he had declined without realizing it. The absence now felt heavier than her presence ever had. He picked up his phone more often than usual. Not to call her. Just to avoid sitting in the stillness. Because stillness, now, was reflecting something back at him. He had believed strength meant emotional self-containment. But self-containment, without sharing, turns into isolation. For the first time, he didn't feel calm. He felt exposed. Not because she had left, but because he was finally alone with the version of himself she had quietly been reacting to all along. And in that silence, he began to feel what she had been feeling. 10. Emotional unavailability. Emotional unavailability doesn't feel obvious from the inside. From the inside, it feels disciplined, controlled, measured. Ethan had always prided himself on not being reactive. He didn't overshare. He didn't collapse under pressure. He didn't need constant reassurance. He thought that made him secure. But security and avoidance can look identical at first glance. He began asking himself questions he had never entertained before. Why did vulnerability feel threatening? Why did emotional intensity make him retreat? Why did closeness trigger subtle discomfort? The answers weren't dramatic. They were early. Childhood moments where emotions were dismissed. Times when expressing need was labeled weakness. Situations where self-reliance was praised more than connection. He learned that composure was rewarded. So he mastered composure. But mastery of composure is not the same as mastery of intimacy. Intimacy requires emotional risk. Risk means uncertainty. Uncertainty means loss of control. And control had always been his anchor. He realized something difficult. He wasn't calm because he felt safe. He was calm because he refused to enter spaces that felt unsafe. He avoided emotional depth the way someone avoids deep water. Not because the water is inherently dangerous, but because they never learned how to swim. Claire had been inviting him into deeper water. He had stayed near the shore, calling it maturity, calling it stability, calling it strength. Now he saw it differently. Emotional unavailability isn't the absence of love. It's the presence of fear disguised as independence. And fear, when unexamined, quietly shapes behavior. He hadn't been malicious. He had been guarded. But guarded love still leaves someone alone. 11. The fear beneath control. Control feels powerful. It keeps emotions predictable. It keeps vulnerability contained. But beneath control, there is usually fear. Ethan began tracing it back. The discomfort he felt when Claire cried wasn't irritation. It was helplessness. Helplessness made him feel inadequate. Inadequacy felt dangerous. So he defaulted to logic. Logic restored superiority. Superiority restored control. Control restored calm. It was a loop. A subtle one. He had believed that if he allowed himself to feel too much, he would lose composure. If he lost composure, he would lose respect. If he lost respect, he would lose love. So he limited his emotional range. Not intentionally. Strategically. But strategies built for survival don't always support intimacy. He realized that when Claire said, "I need you to feel this with me," she wasn't asking for solutions. She was asking for shared vulnerability. And vulnerability had always felt like exposure. Exposure meant potential rejection. So he rejected first, quietly. By withdrawing. By minimizing. By staying emotionally 2 steps removed. It wasn't cruelty. It was preemptive protection. But protection without participation feels like absence. For the first time, he admitted something uncomfortable. He had feared being needed. Because being needed meant responsibility for someone else's emotional world. And he had never learned how to hold that safely. So he avoided depth. And called it strength. Now he saw it clearly. Strength without openness is rigidity. Rigidity cracks under pressure. And by the time he understood the fear beneath his control, the pressure had already broken what he thought was stable. 12. Abandonment in reverse. He had always believed she left him. But slowly, painfully, he began to understand something else. He had left first. Not physically. Emotionally. Abandonment doesn't always look like walking out the door. Sometimes it looks like staying. But never fully arriving. Claire had said she felt alone next to him. At the time, he thought it was exaggeration. Now it felt precise. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't betrayed. He hadn't disappeared. But he had withheld. Withheld depth. Withheld vulnerability. Withheld emotional risk. He offered presence without participation. And participation is what love requires. He realized that every time she leaned in and he subtly leaned back, something invisible fractured. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But cumulatively. He had feared being abandoned. So he protected himself by never fully attaching. He thought distance would prevent loss. But distance created it. That's abandonment in reverse. You emotionally withdraw to avoid being left. And in doing so, you become the one who leaves first. It's not intentional. It's protective. But protection without connection still wounds. He began to see how she must have felt. Reaching. Waiting. Explaining. Hoping. And gradually realizing she was reaching toward someone who never stepped forward. He didn't mean to abandon her. But impact doesn't negotiate with intention. And that realization hurt more than the breakup itself. Because it meant the loss wasn't random. It was patterned. And he had participated in creating it. For the first time, he stopped blaming timing. Stopped blaming incompatibility. Stopped blaming emotional differences. He saw the truth quietly forming. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she had been loving alone. 13. The mirror moment. Self-awareness rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives quietly. Ethan found himself rereading old messages. Not searching for evidence against her. But searching for evidence against himself. There were texts he had skimmed over at the time. I don't feel close lately. I miss how we used to talk. I just want to feel understood. He had responded with reassurance. Now he saw the subtext. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was asking for presence. He remembered specific nights. The way she looked at him after sharing something vulnerable. That half-second pause. Waiting. He used to interpret that pause as emotional intensity he needed to stabilize. Now he understood it differently. It was a door opening. And he had stood still. The mirror moment isn't about shame. It's about clarity. He saw the version of himself she had been responding to. Measured. Guarded. Emotionally contained. He had mistaken containment for strength. But strength that never bends cannot hold another person's weight. He noticed something else. He had rarely said, "I'm scared." Rarely said, "I don't know." Rarely admitted confusion. He had believed leadership in a relationship meant certainty. Now he realized certainty without vulnerability feels distant. The mirror didn't accuse him. It revealed him. And revelation is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. He could no longer say, "That's just how I am." He began asking instead, "Why am I like this?" And that question marked the beginning of change. Not reconciliation. Not reversal. But awareness. And awareness, though painful, is power. 14. Redefining strength. Strength used to mean control. Now it meant something else. Ethan began redefining it slowly. Strength is not emotional silence. Strength is staying when emotions feel overwhelming. Strength is saying, "I don't know how to do this, but I'm willing to try." He realized he had confused composure with connection. You can be composed and still unavailable. You can be calm and still absent. He thought strength meant not needing reassurance. Now he saw strength as being willing to give it. He thought strength meant not reacting. Now he saw strength as responding with empathy. He thought strength meant independence. Now he saw strength as interdependence. The kind where two people can lean without fear. He understood something painful. Claire hadn't needed perfection. She had needed participation. Not solutions. Not certainty. Participation. He couldn't change the past. But he could change the pattern. That required vulnerability. And vulnerability felt like risk. But risk, he realized, is the cost of real intimacy. He practiced small shifts. Naming his emotions aloud. Sitting in discomfort without escaping. Listening without fixing. It felt awkward, unfamiliar. But growth always does. For the first time, strength felt softer. Less rigid. More human. And in redefining strength, he wasn't trying to win her back. He was trying to become someone who could love without leaving first. 15. The unsent message. He wrote the message 3 times. Deleted it 3 times. The first version was defensive. "I didn't realize. I was trying. I never meant to hurt you." It sounded like explanation. Not ownership. The second version was emotional. "I miss you. I finally understand. Can we try again?" It sounded like panic. Not growth. The third version was quieter. "I see it now. I wasn't as present as I thought. I'm working on becoming different." He stared at the screen. The urge to send it wasn't about love. It was about relief. Relief from guilt. Relief from loneliness. Relief from the discomfort of sitting with consequence. But consequence is part of maturity. He realized something subtle. If he sent the message to ease himself, he would still be centering himself. And this time, he wanted to do something different. Growth isn't proven by what you say when you're afraid of losing someone. It's proven by what you change when no one is watching. So he didn't send it. Not because he didn't care. But because caring no longer meant convincing. It meant becoming. He closed his phone. Sat in the silence. And for the first time, the silence didn't accuse him. It taught him. He wasn't trying to win her back anymore. He was trying to stop abandoning himself emotionally. And that's when something shifted. The message remained unsent. But the lesson stayed. 16. The new definition. Strength feels different now. Quieter. Less rigid. More honest. Ethan no longer equates calmness with superiority. He no longer confuses distance with stability. He has learned something simple but difficult. Being needed isn't weakness. Being vulnerable isn't loss of control. Saying, "I feel," isn't surrender. It's courage. He practices staying present when emotions rise. Not fixing immediately. Not retreating. Just staying. He practices naming fear instead of disguising it as logic. He practices listening without preparing a defense. It's uncomfortable. It's imperfect. But it's real. He understands now that emotional abandonment rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with subtle absence. And subtle absence is preventable, if noticed. He cannot rewrite the past. But he can refuse to repeat it. That's the new definition. Strength is not emotional containment. Strength is emotional participation. Strength is not staying composed at all costs. Strength is staying connected, even when it's hard. If you saw yourself in this story, not as the villain, not as the victim, but as someone who has quietly withdrawn before, then you're not alone. Awareness is not shame. It's the first step toward doing it differently next time. And if this conversation made you pause, if it felt uncomfortably accurate, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Because we don't shout here. We uncover. Quietly. And sometimes the quiet truth changes everything.